In April of 1977, 3 teenagers reported seeing something they couldn't identify on the dark roads of Dover, Massachusetts. The encounters happened over 2 consecutive nights. Their descriptions were similar, and the sketches were made immediately after the sightings. There were no photographs, no confirmed physical evidence, and nearly 50 years later, there has been no retraction. The figure was described as roughly 4 feet tall, with a thin body and a disproportionately large head, no visible hair, no clearly defined facial features, and large eyes reflecting light in the darkness. The case became known as the Dover Demon. But before any theory, misperception, social suggestion, or something beyond that, there's a simpler question. What really happened on those 2 nights? This is the Shadow Archive. Today, we'll reconstruct the events step by step, analyze the witnesses, evaluate credibility, and examine natural and supernatural explanations to understand why this case still sits in a gray zone between science and the unknown. April 1977, Dover, Massachusetts. The investigation begins now.
In 1977, Dover was a small, rural town located about 15 miles southwest of Boston. Public lighting was limited, the roads were narrow and winding, and colonial stone walls lined long stretches of pavement. Dense wooded areas and small streams cut through the landscape, and at night, many sections became almost completely dark. The sightings occurred within this exact setting: isolated roads, early spring conditions, mild weather, and virtually no traffic after a certain hour. Dover was not known for unexplained phenomena, and there was no established history of similar sightings. It was a quiet community where most families knew one another. However, the broader cultural context of the United States at the time is also relevant. The 1970s were marked by heightened public interest in extraterrestrial phenomena. Books, television programs, and reports of UFO sightings had already entered mainstream conversation. Later that same year, in November 1977, Close Encounters of the Third Kind would premiere, reinforcing the now familiar image of large-headed, wide-eyed beings. Although the film had not yet been released in April, similar imagery was already circulating in popular culture. This does not prove direct influence, but it does show that the collective imagination of the era was already familiar with certain visual patterns. It was within this physical environment, dark, rural, and isolated, and this cultural atmosphere, curious and open to the unusual, that 3 separate groups of teenagers claimed to have seen the same thing. Everything began on the night of April 21st, 1977.
On April 21st, 1977, around 10:30 p.m., 17-year-old Bill Bartlett was driving along a narrow road in Dover with friends in the car. As he passed a stretch lined with stone walls on the left, something caught his attention in the headlights. Perched on the wall, partially illuminated, was a figure. Bill later described it as approximately 4 feet tall, with a thin body and long arms and legs. The skin appeared smooth and hairless, pale or peach-colored in tone. The head seemed too large for the body, oval or bulbous in shape, with no visible mouth, nose, or ears, only 2 large eyes reflecting an orange glow in the light. The sighting lasted only seconds. Bill kept driving. That same night, after returning home, he drew what he had seen and dated the sketch, a detail that would later become central to the case. About an hour later, in another area of town, 15-year-old John Baxter was walking alone when he reported seeing a figure in the distance. At first, he assumed it was someone he knew, but as he approached, he realized the proportions were not normal. According to John, the figure had a thin body, a narrow neck, and a disproportionately large head. The skin appeared pale, and there were no clearly defined facial features, only 2 dark areas where the eyes should have been. He stated that the figure moved quickly toward a wooded area. Later, he also produced a drawing. The overall structure closely resembled the one described by Bill.
The following night, April 22, 15-year-old Abby Brabham was in a car with her boyfriend, 18-year-old Will Tainter. As they drove along a road near dense vegetation and a small creek, they noticed something crouched near the roadside. Abby had the clearest view. She described a humanoid figure, hairless, thin-bodied, with a large oblong head. The eyes appeared large and reflected a greenish glow in the vehicle's light. The sighting was brief, and like the others, it involved no communication and no physical contact. Abby later documented what she saw in a drawing. In total, there were 3 encounters over 2 consecutive nights in the same small small town. The shared characteristics were consistent: approximately 4 feet tall, a thin, hairless body, a disproportionately large head, large reflective eyes, and no clearly defined facial features. Subtle differences appeared mainly in eye reflection color, orange in one case, green in another, but the structural description remained consistent. No witness reported physical contact, and no one mentioned a craft or lights in the sky, only the figure. Up to that point, the accounts were circulating primarily among classmates, but soon the story would move beyond Dover and receive a name.
In the days that followed, the reports began circulating among students at the same high school. Dover was a small town, and information traveled quickly. Initially, however, there was no media push, no press conference, and no attempt to turn the episode into a spectacle. The first adult to take the account seriously was science teacher Robert Linton. When he heard Bill Bartlett describe what he had seen, he showed genuine interest and encouraged that the drawing be preserved. That immediate documentation would later become a key element of the case. Shortly afterward, the story came to the attention of Loren Coleman, a researcher known for investigating reports of unusual creatures and unexplained phenomena. Coleman interviewed the witnesses separately and analyzed the drawings. In his assessment, the teenagers appeared sincere. It was Coleman who popularized the name that would define the episode. From that moment on, the case was no longer just a local account.
When an event receives a name, it gains identity, and once it gains identity, it enters the public imagination. The Dover Police Department was informed. There was no formal criminal investigation since no crime had occurred. However, the teenagers had no known disciplinary issues and were not considered troublemakers. No physical evidence was documented, no footprints were officially recorded, and no confirmed wave of similar sightings followed in the days immediately after. Once the story reached local media, it moved beyond the boundaries of the town, and at that point, something changed. What had once been a private experience became a public narrative. When a narrative becomes public, memory, interpretation, and expectation begin to interact. Before discussing perception or collective influence, one essential question must be addressed. Were the witnesses reliable? Serious documentary tone, calm pacing, neutral delivery, no dramatic emphasis. Before analyzing possible explanations, the credibility of the witnesses must be examined. The first factor is the drawings. Bill Bartlett documented what he saw on the same night as the sighting and signed and dated the sketch. John Baxter also produced a drawing shortly afterward, and Abby Brabham did the same. Drawings created immediately after an event reduce the likelihood of long-term memory distortion. The second factor is reputation. According to local accounts, the teenagers had no history of serious disciplinary issues, and the Dover Police Department identified no clear motive for fraud. Third is the absence of gain. There was no significant financial benefit and no initial attempt to seek national attention. The case gained notoriety primarily after the involvement of Loren Coleman, not through direct initiative by the witnesses. Fourth is long-term consistency. There has been no public retraction, no later confession, and the core descriptions have remained stable for decades. Taken together, these elements support the idea that the witnesses were sincere. However, sincerity does not guarantee accuracy. There are also factors that require caution. All of the witnesses attended the same school, lived in the same small community, and reported their experiences within less than 24 hours. This creates room for indirect influence. Even without intention, accounts can align through conversation, and memories can unconsciously adjust details over time. Another point is the structural similarity of the drawings. They are not identical, but they share consistent proportions. This could indicate that they all observed the same phenomenon, or it could suggest that after hearing the first account, subsequent interpretations were shaped by emerging narrative. There is no clear evidence of deliberate fraud, but there is also no physical evidence of the creature. The case remains suspended in an intermediate zone. Witnesses who appear sincere, consistent accounts, and an absence of material proof. To move forward, we must examine the most common explanation in cases like this: perceptual error. Serious documentary tone, calm pacing, neutral delivery on rural roads with minimal lighting, where car headlights were the primary source of illumination. Under conditions like these, human vision operates with incomplete information. The brain relies heavily on outline and contrast. Shadows distort proportions. Quick movements can appear exaggerated, and facial details often disappear. Human perception does not record a scene like a camera. It constructs an interpretation. One detail that matters here is eye reflection. The eyes of many animals reflect light when struck by headlights, a phenomenon known as eye shine. Depending on the viewing angle and the species, that reflection can appear orange or green. This could explain part of the variation reported in the Dover sightings. However, it does not fully account for the humanoid structure that was described with unusual consistency.
Serious documentary factor.
Calm pacing, neutral delivery, no dramatic emphasis. Another key factor is memory reconstruction. Memory is not static. It is reconstructed based on emotion in the moment, subsequent conversations, cultural context, and unconscious expectations. This does not imply deception. It reflects normal cognitive function. In a small town like Dover, unintentional contamination is also possible. Students talk, and if one teenager describes a large-headed figure, that image can influence how another person interprets an ambiguous stimulus in the dark. No coordination is required, only exposure to the narrative. But there is an important complication. The drawings were produced shortly after the encounters, which significantly reduces the window for collective memory reconstruction. It does not eliminate psychological influence, but it makes a purely social explanation less straightforward. It is also worth noting that small humanoid beings with oversized heads appear repeatedly in modern culture, across different decades and regions. That repetition may indicate a recurring psychological pattern, a deeply rooted visual archetype, or repeated misinterpretation of similar stimuli. Psychology offers plausible mechanisms, but it does not resolve every element of the case. That is why the Dover demon remains suspended between perceptual error and unresolved anomaly. To move forward, we must examine the competing theories directly, beginning with the most conservative explanations. Nearly 5 decades later, no official explanation has been presented for the Dover demon. The proposed theories generally fall into 2 broad categories: conservative interpretations and extraordinary possibilities. The most common natural explanation is misidentification.
Another explanation is deliberate fabrication, a coordinated hoax among teenagers. Challenges to this theory include the absence of documented planning, no significant financial gain, and no later confession. Hoaxes involving multiple participants often unravel over time due to contradictions, and in this case, that has not occurred. More extraordinary interpretations have also been proposed. One suggests an extraterrestrial encounter. The description resembles what later became widely known as the modern alien archetype: a large head, thin body, and prominent eyes. Although there were no reports of a craft or abduction, the physical similarity is notable. The cultural climate of the 1970s strengthens this interpretation for some observers. There is no physical evidence supporting it, but there is also no definitive evidence disproving it. Another hypothesis proposes an unknown biological entity, sometimes referred to as a cryptid. Massachusetts contains extensive forested areas, making the idea superficially plausible. However, there were no similar documented sightings in the region afterward, no recovered remains, and no pattern of recurrence. That absence significantly weakens the hypothesis.
Some observers point to cultural parallels. Reports of small humanoid beings appear in other contexts. In 1996, in Virginia, witnesses described a creature with a large head and thin body. In the 1960s, the Mothman was reported by multiple individuals within a short period of time. In Algonquian folklore of New England, the Pukwudgie is associated with forests and proximity to water, and notably, the Dover sightings occurred near wooded areas and small streams. These parallels may indicate a recurring cultural pattern, or they may reflect geographic coincidence. In the end, natural theories account for several elements of the case, while extraordinary interpretations attempt to address others. None fully resolve the entire picture. The Dover demon remains suspended in an intermediate zone, not confirmed, and that tension between explanation and uncertainty is precisely why the case continues to be debated.
In April 1977, in Dover, 3 groups of teenagers reported encounters with a figure they could not identify. The accounts occurred over 2 consecutive nights. The descriptions were structurally similar, and the drawings were made immediately after the sightings. There was no physical evidence, no photographic record, and no biological confirmation, but there was also no retraction, no confession of fraud, and no major inconsistencies that completely disqualified the witnesses. The case became known as the Dover demon. What we know is limited. We know the witnesses described a small figure with a large head and thin body. We know the environment was dark and rural. We know the human mind reconstructs experience, and that cultural archetypes influence perception. What we do not know is whether what was seen was a misidentified animal, an illusion shaped by suggestion, an unintentional collective reconstruction of memory, a coordinated fabrication, or something we still do not understand. The mystery persists not because of extraordinary proof, but because of the absence of a definitive explanation. Nearly 50 years later, the question remains open. What did those teenagers truly encounter on that road in April 1977? Do you believe this was a simple perceptual error, a subtle hoax that was never exposed, or an event that still defies conventional explanation? And most importantly, what detail in the case influences your conclusion? This is the Shadow Archive, and the investigation continues.